Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Diermeier. I'm the Provost of the University of Chicago. And today it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our discussion on jobs and the economy with U.S. Senator Mark Warner. This is certainly a timely and relevant topic that deserves all of our attention. And I'm particularly happy to see so many faculty and students in the audience today. Thank you for joining us and to take the time to participate in this important event. Today's event is organized and hosted by the Becker Friedman Institute for Economics, or as it's affectionately known, the BFI. It was launched in 2011 to provide a collaborative platform for the large and very diverse University of Chicago economics community with over 250 PhDs in economics working on campus and a whole variety of additional scholars and students engaged in research relating to the economy, having an institute that can bring our scholars, students, and researchers together around the common research topics, allows us to coordinate and leverage our work in a way that can have real impact. At the University of Chicago, as you all know, we're committed to rigorous inquiry with impact, and the Becker Friedman Institute models this approach in an exemplary fashion by promoting and supporting the highest caliber of economics research, while also focusing on the translation and dissemination of that work to policymakers, business leaders, and other interested stakeholders. My great thanks goes to Michael Greenstone and Eric Hurst for the leadership of the BFI. And now I am particularly pleased to introduce our accomplished undergraduate economics student, Lindsay Currier, who will tell us about today's speaker. Lindsay is a fourth-year undergraduate here at the college, majoring in economics and mathematics. She's an active member in Economica, U Chicago's undergraduate organization for economic and research. She has worked as a research assistant, and most recently, she was a summer intern for Ubernomics, which is Uber's economic research team. So you can see Lindsay is a real slacker. And so let's all welcome her for joining us here today. And with that, I'll turn the podium over to Lindsay.
First of all, thanks to the BFI for hosting. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Michael Greenstone, and our speaker, Mark Warner. Michael Greenstone is the director of the BFI, the Milton Friedman Professor of Economics, the college, and the Harris School, and the director of the Energy Policy Institute at Chicago. He has conducted groundbreaking research on the costs and benefits of environmental policy and energy choices, credit markets, and trends in the changing American workforce. Professor Greenstone was chief economist on the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama, and has been a leader in bringing new economic research down from the ivory tower to Washington. Senator Mark Warner is a senior senator from the Commonwealth of Virginia. He has served in the Senate since 2009, and prior to that served as governor of Virginia from 2002 to 2006. Senator Warner is the vice chairman of the Select Committee on Intelligence and a member of the Finance, Banking, Budget, and Rules Committees. As both senator and as governor, Senator Warner has demonstrated an understanding of emerging economic issues and has worked to find bipartisan solutions to financial reform, U.S. deficits, minimum wage, new business growth, and more. Recently, Senator Warner has introduced legislation to encourage skills training for low and middle-income workers, and separate legislation to explore solutions to the lack of benefits for workers in the gig economy. To talk about the challenges facing American workers today, we've brought together an academic with a strong understanding of policy and a policymaker who has made it a priority to address economic issues. Please join me in welcoming Michael Greenstone and Senator Mark Warner.
Welcome, Senator Warner. We're pleased to have you here today.
Thank you, Michael.
We're sorry it's not a little bit warmer, but we're working on that. So first, just get business out of the way. Everyone has a note card, and will be time for questions at the end. And if you have a question, write on the note card, and we'll come by and collect it. So I was doing a little background research on you, not opposition research, friendly research.
We'll see if the question.
Yeah. And I noticed that I had forgotten this. I thought you'd been in the Senate longer, but you became senator in 2009. The economy was losing at that point in January 2009, 700,000 jobs per month. Today, it's gaining about 300,000 jobs per month. To what would you explain the million job per month reversal? And what role has the federal government played in it, or government?
I think actually, I remember getting hired in November 2008, and my background had been in business as a technology venture capitalist. I had been involved, I was co-founder of a company called Nextel in the wireless business, had gone off and become governor, and I was aware, obviously, as I was running for Senate, of the financial meltdown. But when I got hired and I got put on the banking committee and realized how close we had come in the fall and that winter to complete economic collapse, it was a little frightening. I always remember at first being on the banking committee, we were looking at issues of how we were going to grapple with this, and I asked a couple of good questions, and a couple of guys came up to me, fellow senators, and said, "Gosh, Warner, you really get this stuff." And I kind of puffed up for a little bit, and then I thought, oh my gosh, I understand a little piece, but not nearly the ramifications of what we had to grapple with. And I actually think that history will treat, under both President Bush, Secretary Paulson, and the final couple of months of the Bush administration, and those first 6 months of the Obama administration, as, well, by no means perfect, by doing the right thing, by recognizing that the system was teetering on the brink of what could have led to a depression, and taking at that point extraordinarily bold steps in terms of bailing out the financial institutions, putting in place the stimulus, actions, I think particularly President Obama, having a calming effect with a rational approach, some would say too rational approach. I could only imagine what would have happened if we'd had our current president elected at that moment in time, where our economy might have headed. And while it took longer than we would have liked, you started to see the staunching of that growth, or of those job losses, within the first 6 months of the Obama administration. On top of that, you had, obviously, and a lot of credit should go as well to Bernanke, Tim Geithner, on a very much a quantitative easing strategy in terms of monetary policy. And all that combined led us to where the economy has recovered. Now, while we're approaching full employment, we've not seen, and we can get into this as the discussion goes on, job growth go along with the economic recovery at the level that I would like to see. And we have this moment in time where, in effect, the whole world's economy seems to be in a bit of sync in terms of moving forward. That's the good news. The bad news is, and what I think is, and Lindsay was kind enough to say, Warner, since he's been in the Senate, has been working on fiscal discipline, and on that category, I think I get a D-, because I was very involved in the efforts to try to grapple with our debt and deficit. And if anything, I would argue, the kind of loose money monetary policy combined with lack of fiscal discipline, which has led our nation to a $20 trillion debt, you put that on top of tax policies that took place in December that I think history will treat as a disaster, even though the goals were appropriate, where I would argue we will add about $2.2 trillion of additional debt on that $20 trillion of debt. And I think we are, in a sense, living on borrowed time at this moment in terms of So
I'm very curious about that. What happened? You were a leader with the Gang of Six and throughout your career on fiscal discipline and doing it in a bipartisan way. What happened to fiscal responsibility? And you know the numbers better than I do, but I looked it up this morning. The debt to GDP ratio for basically 50 years was 34%. It's now 75%, and then with the tax bill and the spending bill, it's projected to be in 10 years, maybe 100%, and if some of the things are made permanent, maybe even more.
Right, and history has always shown any industrialized nation, once you get above 80, and surely if you get above 90 debt to GDP, you got a crisis. I think that what has happened has been a couple things. One, we've had historically low inflation, and we've had this loose money policy for a long period of time, and those of us who have been, like myself, who have been folks saying, the debt is going to get us, the debt is going to get us. We keep running up this debt, and it's not gotten us so far. And that that has, I think, taken a lot of the air out of the balloon in terms of being fiscally responsible. You've also had the fact that the Republican Party, which has been based on a, let's spend a lot and cut revenues. America, prior to the tax reform effort in December, we were 32nd out of 35 OECD nations in terms of total tax burden, state, local, and federal combined. So we are at the bottom of the barrel in terms of revenues collected, in terms of our industrial competitors. And after the tax cuts in December, we will go even further down. Yet our spend items, particularly around entitlements, where the Democrats have refused to acknowledge the math about the fact that we are growing older, and that great programs like Social Security and Medicare, everybody loves, but the math just doesn't work anymore. When I was young, there were 15 people working for every one person on retirement. Today, there are 3 people working for every one person on retirement. The problem with that is not the politician's fault. It's actually the doctor's faults, because we're living longer. That usually gets a little bigger reaction until it's an economics crowd here. But what we've done is, by this spiraling amount of spend that doesn't get contained in terms of entitlement reform, and dramatically cutting back on our revenue growth, means that as a nation, if you look at the United States government as an enterprise, for every dollar you send Washington right now, only 6 cents is spent on education, infrastructure, and research and development. Now, as somebody who was a venture capitalist longer than a politician, I would never invest in a venture that spent 6% of its revenues on its workforce, plant, and equipment, and staying ahead of the competition, which, again, education, infrastructure, and R&D in a global economy. So I think we're living on borrowed time, and it's been frustrating. We're now, the fun factoid I like to run by, and I have to be careful with my factoids again with this group, but interest rates go up 100 basis points, and they will. That adds, just in additional debt service, about $160 billion a year per year in additional debt service on that $20 trillion base. That $160 billion off the top, before you pay Social Security, before you buy guns, and sure as heck before you invest in education, is more than we spend on Department of Homeland Security and Federal Department of Education. So I don't think we're on a sustainable business plan, but the attitude towards all of the efforts to control that with a balance of revenue increases and spending constraint has completely gone out the window. Matter of fact, we've gone the opposite direction.
So how do you think that happened? What has, there's people like to glorify the past and leave it better than you found it. That doesn't seem to be the attitude, certainly not what you're describing.
Well, the thing,
what do we owe this change?
This will come as a shock, but politicians love to promise, I'm going to cut your taxes, yet I'm going to spend more money. And, and let's, again, acknowledge this is not a new phenomenon. In the, prior to I was very involved in what was called the Simpson-Bowles plan, which, while not perfect, had a balance of entitlement reform and tax reform that would have generated more revenues. I started something called the Gang of Six, and again, I work in the only place in America where being a gang member is a good thing. I'm part of every bipartisan gang there is. We had moments in time in the 2010, 2011, 2012 period, and when we didn't act, and again, we did cut the deficit, but I work again in the only place in America when we're high-fiving each other that we were only $500 billion in the red for a couple of years. That number will go back to $1 trillion in the red. I am distinctly worried that the tax bill, and then quite honestly, the spending bill of 2 weeks ago. The spending bill of 2 weeks ago ended up pushing discretionary spending back up a little bit more to where I think historically it should be. But this is, again, borrowed time, and I would even argue, I know we may get into this later, we hit, in this last defense spending bill, about $700 billion on defense alone, 10x some of our nearest competitors, and I'm not sure we're even spending it on the right thing. But this area of fiscal discipline, and I don't think, I think ludicrous growth assumptions that have come out of the administration that says, oh, we're going to get 4%, 5%. I mean, I don't think there's any legitimate economist who thinks that growth alone is going to solve this problem in terms of our federal spending and federal balance sheet.
Yeah, I think the evidence is pretty strong on that. I wondered, the one thing that BFI really tries to do, and then we're going to turn to labor markets in a minute, but is take research that's policy relevant or relevant for the real world and kind of make it digestible. What are the questions that you think academics are not delivering answers to that would be useful to address some of these questions?
Well, I think there would be, more proof on dollars spent on, I would argue the three areas. We've got a lot of data, but the more compelling we can make on spending money on education, spending money on infrastructure, and spending money on basic research in terms of the payout on that, I think would help us. I mean, we all know we all have our arguments, but if there was a way to make that more forward-leaning, it would be important. One of the areas that I've tried to focus.
Is there an audience for that? We're in a post-facts world now. Right?
I think there may be an audience. I for one, we may get later into the Russia investigation, since I know that's the only reason most of you are here. But when you point out China's investment levels in artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computing, and 5G technology versus ours, and you post this in a national security context, the one area where you can get politicians to agree to spend is national security. So if you will look, for example, while we've seen some increases in medical research in the last few years, actually this last budget we did put a little bit more into NIH, but the vast majority of increased medical spend in the last decade has been, strangely enough, put into the Department of Defense budget, because it's a hell of a lot easier to get people to vote for a Department of Defense budget spend than it is to get it to vote for NIH spend. Now, that may not be rational, but that is the reality. On the question of revenues, it's hard to make the case. I mean, you can show all the data in the world that America's overall tax burden falls in the bottom 10th and now closer to 34th out of 35th after the tax cut, but most Americans don't believe that. And we misuse a point in time, such as the fact that until the tax reform, our corporate tax rate was nominally the highest of the industrial nations in the world. The effective tax rate was much lower, but the reason why our tax rate on the corporate side was much higher is that every other nation in the world has a VAT or some version of a consumer tax or value-added tax. We don't have that. Until they put in place that kind of taxation system, their corporate rates were just as high, if not higher, than ours. So the argument, you're going to have really good economists to start making taxation a little more popular, but the notion that we can have stuff for nothing, we've run that streak, and remember that coming up to the point of the crisis, we'd run 65 out of the previous 70 years on an annual deficit basis. So there's no solution set here that says, oh, this is all the Democrats' fault or all the Republicans' fault. There's plenty of mutual blame to go along. But we are able to sustain that, and we have been able to sustain that until we don't. And in the volatility period that we have right now, the notion that at some point, whether if America's ever questioned as a reserve currency, or people decide that they don't want, that our our debt to GDP ratio gets so high that people don't want to continue to buy the promise that America is going to pay its debts on a rational basis, i.e. our bonds, then all hell could break loose. A spike in interest rates makes our current operating system unsustainable.
Now, one idea that it floats around, at least in the rooms that I'm in the University of Chicago, is there's a great solution to all of these budget problems. It's so simple. It's almost embarrassing to say it aloud. But a carbon tax, wouldn't that get rid of a bad and help solve the budget problems? And it feels to me like people aren't lining up to support it.
You think? No, I think carbon tax.
But it's such an obvious policy.
Except for the fact that, listen, should carbon tax be part of the mix of the discussion? Absolutely. Should we tax externalities in a rational way? And could you do a progressive carbon tax that actually returned money to low and moderate income people?
All of that.
The two-part answer I give you, though, is one, we've yet to see that instituted in a realistic way anywhere in the world. And even the Europeans
I think British Columbia is pretty close.
Well, British Columbia is getting there, but if you look at where, if you look at even where some of the Europeans tried to move on their initial move towards a cap and trade system, it didn't work out, and then cap and trade was too easy to be gamed. I think a straight carbon tax would be a better solution. But if anything, the country's moving in the opposite direction when it appears that the Trump administration is trying to release the auto industry from the CAFE standards in terms of the 55 mile per gallon goal, and the vast majority of the automakers didn't even ask for that relief. So
we'll keep that on the sidelines. It's going to check into the game later.
It will check. Well, whether it's a carbon tax, whether it's a value-added tax, the notion of a taxation system that fits us in the 21st century, is long overdue. I mean, but remember, we are in a nation right now in America where we still have been unwilling to tax internet purchases, their sales tax, the same way we do bricks and mortar. Now, I was an internet guy and a tech guy longer than I've been a politician. There may have been a reason to give that nascent industry in the late 90s some advantage, but that advantage has long since passed, and you are basically robbing states who a lot of times K-12 and infrastructure falls to their responsibility more than the feds. You are robbing them of one of the few remaining revenue growth areas just by having that ban on what's called, again, the Marketplace Fairness Act.
One thing I want to turn to is it is true that since you arrived in the Senate, the number of jobs per month created has gone up by 1 million a month. To which you deserve a lot of credit, but not all Americans seem to have been benefiting even dating further back, maybe to 1980 or so. There's my colleague Eric Hurst and Corinne Charles just released a paper. Employment among men aged 21 to 55 has declined by about 5 percentage points since 2000. If you have less than a high school degree, it's maybe 7 or 8 percentage points. There's also all the reporting about the opioid crisis, the dissolution of families, single parent, the children being raised just by one parent, and just visceral pain for lots and lots of American families. I know this is something you've thought a lot about. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what some of your thoughts on what we should be doing, both for the people who are already post-schooling or post-traditional schooling,
sure.
And the people who make sure this doesn't keep happening.
Well, here's my theory of the case. And I actually thought this is where I was going to spend all my time. I got rehired to the Senate in 2014. It was a closer election than I expected. My observation was that what creates a Trump or the ascendancy of a Bernie Sanders on the left is people, in a sense, losing faith that the system we've got is working.
I exactly have that view, that this mass of people is not unrelated to the difficulty of long-run planning and having a budget that appears kind of rational, that a venture capitalist would think wasn't crazy. I think it's kind of all the same thing.
But here's what I got interested, I know we're probably going to get to this later, in kind of early 2015 in what at that point was like the cool new hot thing, the gig economy. And you've got lots of folks here more expert than I on it. Gig economy is still relatively small as a percentage of our workforce, but what is not so small is the fact that starting in the 90s as large firms, and I would argue started to take any job that was not core to its purpose and outsource it. Either literally outsource it in terms of moving it abroad, or outsource it in terms of taking non-core functions and turning them into independent contractors. I mean, name me a Fortune 100 firm anymore that still has its janitorial staff, its kitchen staff, or anyone else on the company payroll. They've all been outsourced. And what that, I would argue part of that is based, and I hope we'll get this to another question, is that, and I say this as somebody who's absolutely been a pure beneficiary of our free enterprise system. First in my family to graduate from college, law school, went out, failed miserably a couple times as an entrepreneur, third time was successful in cell phones, done better than I can ever expected. But I gotta tell you, modern American capitalism, I don't think it's working for enough people. And I think there are a variety of outgrowths of that, part of it being the enormous business focus on short-termism over long-term value creation. And there's a whole set of policy changes we could do there. But if we stay on the workforce, what has grown since the mid-90s to where it is today is the growth of the contingent workforce. And that we set up a system in the 1930s and 1940s in this country, which was a social contract that worked really well for 80 years. It was a deal between business, labor, and government that presumed that once you got a job at one firm, chances were you're going to stay working at that firm for most of your career. My dad worked for the same company for 38 years. Never made a lot of money. But he had relatively security in that job, and with that job came health, retirement, and if he were to lose his job, you had unemployment, workman's comp, disability, a series of state-run programs to provide that social safety net. Starting in the 90s, and I would argue partially forced by short-termism, as companies took more and more jobs that were non-core and outsourced them, we've seen this enormous growth in a contingent workforce. And post-financial crisis, that ramp up started going like this. Now, some people have moved into this contingent workforce by choice. The flexibility of working when you want or how you want is a unique difference that is made possible by technology. Some of that is being forced by millennials who don't have that, who abhor the idea of working for the same firm for 30 years. But depending on the data, you got anywhere from 20 to about 38% of the American workforce that is working either as gig, part-time, independent contractor, trying to be an entrepreneur themselves, doing a startup. And what's happened with that section of the workforce is that they have no social safety net. We may be the only industrial nation in the world that really means your social insurance is contingent upon your worker status. You gotta be a long-term W-2 employee. So what I've been working on, to give two examples, is I don't think we're gonna go back to the economy where folks work for the same firm for 30 years. Let's meet the workforce where it's at, not get involved in this backwards-looking 20th century labor classification battle between 1099 and W-2, and let's recognize we got to create a portable benefit system. So from that first job you get at 16 or 18, some portion of your pay would go to you. Now, who runs that portable benefit? That's a jump ball. I'm not saying it has to be the state. I'm not saying it has to be the government. It could be private sector. It could be fintech. It could be run on your phone. But I would argue that part of the disillusionment in our society today is not only based on income inequality, but income insecurity, because if you are in this contingent work, not only do you not have any social insurance, but your volatility of your income has gone up dramatically. And unless we can create a portable benefit system as well as income smoothing tools for a workforce that I've seen data that says you're going to go from a third of the workforce in this status to about 50% of the workforce by 2025, the amount of social unease is going to exponentially rise. The second point, and then I'll move on, but if you accept the premise that nobody's going to work for the same firm for 30 plus years, then it becomes, and again, for a University of Chicago economist crowd, this is right up your alley. There is no rational reason why anyone would invest in upskilling anyone that's a low and moderate income job, because those jobs are the most likely to be eliminated by technology or to potentially be outsourced. And if you're not going to work for a long period of time in that position, why upskill you? Whereas historically, even if you weren't the world's brightest bulb, you got to work on the line, you could bump up on the line up to your kind of Peter Principle point. Now that's disappeared. So one of the great mistakes amongst many that was made in the ridiculous thing that passed as tax reform last year was, I would have been happy to give corporates, maybe not 21 or 20, but a reasonable competitive corporate rate if you would have traded with them the notion that every firm that takes that rate, and maybe we might even give them a lower rate if they would install this, a meaningful upskilling and workforce training program, because most of what we've done in the past has said it is the public's goal of training you for that first job, and we're still not even getting that fully right, but I would argue even once you're trained for the first job, you're going to need ongoing training. The McKinsey study that said, there will be plenty of jobs even with AI still says 35 to 40% of those jobs are radically going to change over the next 12 years. So if we don't put in place an incentive system, and I think government would screw this up, an incentive system for business to upskill those folks, it's not going to slow down technology or AI, but at least try to equalize. And for example, what we've got, and I've got bipartisan legislation on this, just as I do on a portable benefit system, that said, let's take a very successful tool, the R&D tax credit, and that tax credit being much more lucrative than a simple tax deduction, and apply an R&D tax credit for human capital upgrowth for people that make. Frankly, I don't have as much, I have lots of compassion for you writ large, but if you're getting out of University of Chicago, chances are you're going to be doing pretty well. But why not put in place a human R&D tax credit for people who make less than $90,000 a year? And say, if you want to get the lower corporate rate, put that in place. And how you deliver that, whether it's through a university, whether it's through a community college, those are all things we could experiment on. But unless we start, even if we think about terminology, I buy a computer, that's an asset I can depreciate. I spend the exact same money on training someone, that falls on my balance sheet as a cost, as a liability. Just from accounting to tax, if we're going to make capitalism work for more people again, we've got to not get rid of the incentive system around capitalism, but at least rebalance human capital vis-a-vis plant and equipment and more traditional intellectual capital, I would argue.
Terrific. Now let me ask a tricky question related to all this. The statistics are most disturbing, I find, for men rather than women. Women seem to have understood the signal from the labor market about get your skills no matter how you get them. Maybe they don't have the benefit of the nuanced program you're advocating for, but I think the toughest question in all of social science currently is what the heck is going on with men and why are they doing so much worse? And anytime I start to think of policy, it's very hard because right away I think of some policy that's going to affect both genders, and there's something that is not, somehow the signal's not getting to men. You may just want to say it's a great social science mystery.
That's a really hard question for another time. No, yeah. Where that is particularly happening, it's disproportionately happening in rural America.
Yeah.
And I think what happened was, and I think all of us, myself included, have been victims of this, or have been, not victims, but advocates of this. We have so advocated the building of an interconnected world. We have so advocated the benefits of globalization. We have so advocated, I'm one of the last pro-trade folks and think it was crazy for America to get out of the TPP. But what we have not, and I think as a policymaker we have to acknowledge, is we've done a really crappy job of helping people that have been hurt by trade. We've done a really crummy job of showing, we've shown you can build it in Mumbai and Shanghai. We've done a crummy job of showing you can build it in Springfield, Illinois, or Danville, Virginia. And I think what we have lost are opportunities. And again, here's where I would put it, would have changed the tax law. I strongly believe in the notion of repatriation, that American tax profits that were caught offshore ought to be brought back. But the deal should have been to Apple, if you want to bring a couple $100 billion back, fine, bring it back, I'll give you a really low rate. But you've got to be willing to invest some of that capital in areas that have been losers from trade and not winners. We disproportionately argue the benefits because the benefits have disproportionately fallen to metropolitan areas, and the communities have been left behind, have been rural. And one of the things, the promise of an interconnected world was you shouldn't have to move from your hometown to find a world-class job. We've not proven that to be a reality. So I've got legislation now, for example, I would take Appalachia, which has been some of the hardest areas, where some of the most statistics, whether it's opioids or male employment that used to be coal and other energy dependent, and says, is there a version of a TVA, 21st century TVA? I've got something that would try to double the amount of economic development efforts there that would actually require collaboration between different counties. Because too often, in a lot of rural America, the goal is still, we're going to build a shell building and hope for some miracle to happen and a whole bunch of manufacturing jobs to come. That's probably not going to be the solution set. But I think if you can restore some of that hope, and a lot of that hope comes from jobs. It's one of the reasons why I know this is not the topic, but let me get this bit into why I'm not a fan of UBI, because it sounds like a Silicon Valley dreamed up solution for a group of folks who've made a lot of money and then want to transfer the responsibility back to government to take care of everybody. Because I think what we have to recognize is there is not only material sustenance that comes from work, but there is value that comes from work, and particularly amongst men. I would argue more so even than, women have, they're still family raising, men still have,
Absolutely.
I think, more of a reliance on work from self-value, and we need to do a better job of helping to create meaningful work. I think that is possible. I think it is hard to challenge, the notion of someone who is late career, what you're going to do. But the people I find in Southwest Virginia, in my state, Appalachia, is that even if folks have lost hope, they want their kids to have the choice to remain in the community they grew up in. And frankly, the promise of an interconnected world should give them that choice, and we have not done near enough to make that a reality.
Okay, we have some questions from the floor, but before that, I thought we should probably talk about the pink elephant in the back of the room. The Russia investigation, you're co-leading.
There is no really pink elephant back there.
Not a red elephant. You're co-leading the Senate committee that's investigating the election. There's the Mueller investigation. I guess the House has now concluded its investigation. There's like an endless series of questions, and I'll try and turn it into one or two here. So the first is, what do we actually know at this point among the swirl of everything that has been found out? What do we know about what happened in the run-up to election?
Here's what we know, and here's what we know, not just Mark Warner's a Democratic senator, but virtually every senator, Republican and independent, Republican and Democrat, all of the heads of our law enforcement and intelligence community, both Obama appointees and Trump appointees, even though this may not be acknowledged by the White House. Three things we know for sure. One, the Russians massively intervened in our elections in 2016. They hacked into both political parties, and this sometimes is not recalled. They hacked into both parties. And then they selectively chose to release information to hurt one candidate, Clinton, and to help another candidate, Trump. And we should have been more aware of this beforehand, and frankly, the American government was somewhat caught flat-footed, because if you go back as far as 2011, when the Russian equivalent of their chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Geremasov, basically said Russia could not keep up with the West in tanks, trucks, ships, planes. But where they could keep up is in the realm of cyber warfare and misinformation and disinformation. They even use terminology like misinformation, disinformation spreads like radiation. There is no ability to keep it up. And the techniques they used in America in 2016 had been honed in the Baltic states and in Eastern Europe long before 2016. First point. Second point, we know they either hacked into or at least scanned the voting systems of 21 states. And one of the most vulnerable being Illinois. And what was amazing and almost Kafkaesque from the Trump administration's Department of Homeland Security to start with, the 21 states, they wouldn't tell the top election officials in the 21 states that they'd been attacked, because they said the top election official didn't have the appropriate security clearance.
No, so wait,
A little
hacked
whack.
in, but no, hacked in.
They did not.
Is there any
here's
proof
what
that
happened.
they changed
They did
votes?
not change vote totals.
Okay.
It was almost as if they wanted to leave enough digital dust to know that there had been intervention without changing vote totals. Because you may recall back in the 2016 candidate, one of the candidates for president, even before the election, started to say, well, he might not accept the results of the election. And if there'd been evidence, digital dust, that elections had been tampered with, that candidate might have, Lord knows, done whatever. But it was evident that most of our voting systems are extraordinarily vulnerable. I made sure we had state elections in Virginia last year. We had voting machines that didn't have a paper trail. We made sure we changed out all the voting machines. The president, if in a normal case, you would have had a White House now, then after this evidence of our vulnerability in our election system, would have created a working group to try to take this on and make it a top security concern. Unfortunately, none of the Trump officials, the FBI head, the Director of National Intelligence, the NSA, have been given any direction. So we have, our Senate Intelligence Committee, bipartisan, has came up with a series of recommendations. Make sure every voting machine has a paper trail, make sure you've got appropriate security clearances, have people share information. We had $386 million put into upgrading election security. Third thing, and this is really where things get even more sketchy, is we saw this whole new creation around social media. And let me state at the outset, Facebook and Google and Twitter, these are enormous, iconic American great companies. And they've created a means of communication in social media that unprecedented in terms of its growth and its power of connectivity. But what we saw was the use of that social media, its dark underbelly. It can be used for good, it can also be used for evil. So while at first we thought it was mostly paid advertising, the paid advertising is the tiniest point of the Russian intervention. What was the most important point was the use and the creation of fake accounts. So somebody could say they're Michael from Chicago, and it's actually Boris from St. Petersburg. And what they would do is they would create these accounts, and they would mask their political nature. It might be, University of Illinois football, or it would be gardening, or it would be a host of other issues. And then once they solicited people's information and gained followers, then they would start seeding it with political content. Let me make 2 quick points. I saw it's time to move to questions. I'll give you an example. They created one site in Texas called Secede Texas. Far right-wing site saying, the country's going to hell in a handbasket. We should secede from the Union. They created a similar site that said United Muslims of Texas. Then they created, on the Secede Texas site, they said, these Muslims want to bring Sharia law, so we need to go down and protest. And they set up a protest date at a particular mosque in Houston. On the same date, they said to the United Muslims of Texas, there are a bunch of folks coming down going to protest, we need to protect our faith. Hundreds of people showed up, but for the fact that the Houston police were there, you could have had a tragedy like we had in Charlottesville last year happen in Texas. All generated out of at least a single location in St. Petersburg. And the companies are still unwilling to fully come forward with all the data. So for example, they used the techniques in America, then they went to France, and if the French were a little bit more, weren't as asleep at the switch. So Facebook took down 30,000 accounts in France in advance of the French elections. They've so far identified only 470 accounts in America that were Russian connected. I think there are more. And we're just at the outset. We also have recently had parliamentarians from the UK come in and saying there have been misuse in the Brexit vote. And what's remarkable is if you add up all the money the Russians spent in the American elections, the French elections, and the British elections, it's less than the cost of one new F-35 airplane. Take for a moment another data point. America just put a $700 billion defense budget in place. Russia has a $68 billion defense budget. We are spending 10x. Yet in the realm of misinformation and disinformation, we are behind. In the realm of cyber, and we haven't even gotten to the threats posed by China, this is an asymmetrical conflict that our near-peer adversaries believe is being waged right now. And we are not ready, we are not prepared, and we are still grappling. Last point I'll make on this is we're still grappling with fake accounts being set up. How many of you have heard of deep fake technology? Deep fake technology will come out 2018, 19, and 20. That's where you can put my face on Michael's body appearing in a video. And Lord knows what he does in his off hours. Or if you're a public figure, they will, if you got more than 20 hours of video of someone, you can have a video of me sitting here speaking, and my mouth will be moving, but the words that will come out have nothing to, they'll be my voice, but there'll be nothing in terms of the actual words I'm saying. So the notion that this is not going to get exponentially worse, we're kidding ourselves. And unless we can find a way to sort through this, and I don't want to kneecap the American companies because right behind them there are 25 plus Chinese tech companies, all with asset values north of $20 billion, many of which do as much, if not better, at using some of these tools than the American companies. So this is in many ways the realm of where the new security fight will be. And I feel at times we're buying the world's best 20th century military in terms of tanks, guns, and ships, when the conflict is going to be social media and misinformation and cyber.
Let me ask one, and I'm stealing time from the questions, one related question. I think part of what disturbs me the most out of the recent events is, I think, one enduring feature of the United States that has served it very well for a couple centuries has been very strong institutions, be they the judiciary, the press, separate branches of government. And candidly, it feels like they're under attack. The fake news, the attacking government officials, attacking career staff. Is there a real diminution of institutions, and what does that mean for, what should we make out of all that? Democracies don't have to go on forever.
There is no predestination about America's preeminent role in the 21st century just because we earned it in the 20th century. And it is, candidly, it is more frightening than you think. When the press, a free press has always been viewed as the fourth estate. When the President of the United States and his allies wake up every day and denigrate a free press in this country, then you're entering into frightening times. When you have ad hominem attacks against not just a Mueller investigation, but when you have broad-based ad hominem attacks against the integrity of everyone who works at the FBI, or for that matter, the very underpinnings of our Justice Department, you then end up in an era when individuals start deciding which laws they want to abide by and which ones they don't, because if they're all subject to being, manipulated with, or they're fake, or there is this deep state, then we're in a period of uncertainty unlike anything our country has seen. I've repeatedly tried to go to the floor and talk to my colleagues about, the red line has to be Mueller. Or for that matter, getting rid of Rosenstein, who supervises Mueller, or if this president starts pardoning family members. I can't sit here and tell you where this is going to end. Our investigation is still open. I'm reserving judgment in terms of what level of collaboration, cooperation, whatever took place. I will hold off. But the thing that's so frightening is that when you make these comments and undermine institutions, and then that undermining is accelerated by foreign entities, and the game plan that Russia used in 2016, other countries and entities can use that. It is pennies on the dollar. And that is then reinforced by other fake accounts, and those fake stories or comments are pushed to the top of your news feed by automated bots. Then that pervades your thinking, and the integrity of the institutions get undermined. And once you've done that, even when this president is gone, the undergirding foundation is somewhat questioned. And I believe that there may be times, I believe in the next 8 months, our country may be tested unlike it's been in my lifetime. And I say that as somebody that's old enough to remember, the darkest times of the Cold War, and reminding myself of the challenges around Watergate and Nixon. But there are challenges we could face, and I think we're all going to have to be called upon. And what I hope and pray on is that most of the people I work with are people of good faith, regardless of where their political views fall. But at some point, we're going to have to determine whether we are a nation of a rule of law, and whether any person is above that law, and whether we are a nation that respects our institutions. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't criticize your institutions. That doesn't mean we shouldn't point out their flaws. But pointing out flaws or bad actors is different than impugning the integrity of everyone who works in our Justice Department.
Thank you.
Just to cheer you up on a Monday afternoon.
Okay, so we have some other questions for you. This is just a perfect University of Chicago question for you. It's from the floor. As a recovering entrepreneur, what has led you to think government can allocate capital more efficiently than the private sector in seemingly all areas of research? It's a classic Chicago question.
Classic Chicago question.
Yes.
Well, let me first of all start with the basic market is always right presumption. I think the market is right most times if you fully bake in all our externalities. If you bake in the cost of carbon to our atmosphere, you bake it in, then the market would respond appropriately. I think the market is oftentimes right when depending on which time horizon. If my time horizon is only the next quarter and trying to get that extra 2 cents that I promised Wall Street, then when will I ever invest in human growth or infrastructure or research and development? Because they by nature are not short-term based returns. So if we get the market fully adjusted on the right time horizon, as we say on a corporation is a creature of the state. There is no such thing as a corporate entity without a state charter. Maybe the state charter needs to say a corporate's responsibility and fiduciary duty is to not only shareholders but stakeholders. And maybe there needs to be a redefinition around fiduciary duty. So does the government always get it right on R&D? Absolutely not. But what we have seen in the last 20 years, and since the decline of the Bell Labs and others, we've seen a dramatic decline in basic research from the market side, and it's all been pushed to the public sector side.
For which there's a strong case for the public sector involvement.
Yeah, but that's where I get upset with sometimes the market-only solution. If the market was going to bear the full cost of development, if the market was going to bear the full cost of human capital development, then that would be fine. But what I find, particularly from some business, is this let's push everything that's long-term onto the public's responsibility, and at the same time an effort to starve the public of the resources it needs to do that basic job.
Okay, next question. I'm going to sneak in 2 more before we start getting
the hook.
Yep. Which country did better, or is doing better, or will do better in the tariff battle between the U.S. and China? And I had a trade question too, but I think
I generally think.
And should we be engaging,
Well,
let me broaden the question a little bit. Should we be engaging, is there anything wrong with trade with China?
No, I would argue that trade battles usually end up with more losers than winners. But I would also argue because we've failed to have a cyber doctrine of response, we knew what the rules of the road would be in chemical warfare and landmines. Cyber we've not. So we have had for a decade plus, and particularly vis-a-vis China, enormous theft of intellectual property. We've had a willingness of American companies to go in. They've been so seduced by the size of the Chinese market, they've been willing to do joint development and give up the family jewels in ways they would never do to enter into any other nation. And we have, in the sense of many of the Chinese tech companies, a willingness for them to collaborate with the Chinese government. As we know, what many of the Chinese tech companies are now doing is they are creating, because there's not the equivalent of financial credit in China, they are creating social credit that monitors all of your behavior to the point of how well you are, how good you are at being loyal to the regime. So I think they're operating on a wholly different set of rules, and if I was going to pick a challenge to fight back on China, it would be around intellectual property, it would be around technology, it would be around recognition that we need a willingness to actually occasionally cyber punchback. We've been so afraid of using any of our cyber tools because of our technological advantage. I mean, New York goes dark for 24 hours, it's a crisis. Beijing, until recently, goes dark for 24 hours, it's a problem. But it has been basically a free lunch to come at American intellectual property the last decade plus, and that's where I put my efforts.
Okay, now this is the last question of the day. I think it's a good one to end on. It reflects our undergraduates. As someone who can live and work pretty much in any country, do you think I, parentheses, 21 years old, it's obviously not me, should move to another country like China, India, or some other place? Why should I stay in the United States?
I think
if that's not a softball for politicians.
That is a softball. That is a softball. Listen, I think that, one thing I have enormous respect for China at this point. There is an organized plan. There is a plan and a kind of a rowing in one direction that does not exist in the same fashion here today. What you have to give up in terms of intellectual freedom, liberty, the ability to experiment, the ability to take risks, you find nowhere else. With all the challenge we got, I wouldn't bet against our country on any basis. But to maintain that, I would ask you, here's my three asks of you guys. One is, as much as when the news comes on, probably many of you at this point want to throw a shoe at the TV. I feel the same way, and I'm inside the TV. But don't tune out, because if you tune out and say to hell with all the politics and being involved, all you do is turn the keys over to the extremes. And the one thing the history of this country, which is different than India or Russia or China or most other countries, we for our 270 odd years have basically, we go back and forth, but we've kept it relatively down the middle, and we don't veer from extreme to extreme. And our country's whole premise was based upon the need to compromise. And what I see increasingly in politics are people who believe their side has a monopoly on truth and patriotism. So I'd ask you please not to tune out. Second thing, and this one's actually even a little bit harder, although with a bright group like this, it shouldn't be that hard. Just because somebody says they read it on the internet doesn't mean it's true. And I mention that because it's like when we allow garbage out and not call on it, when we allow actions of politicians or false information, misinformation to go unchallenged, we put one more chink in that armor that holds up, the edifice that holds up our society. And the last thing is, and this is more on the political front, I would argue that we want people to get things done. The biggest difference between being in business and politics is in politics, you can have your whole career and just be against something. In business, you used to get measured by what you get done. And I argue if we want to get stuff done, we've got to then reward people of goodwill in both political parties. So that means occasionally getting out of our own political foxholes. And yes, that means if you're a Democrat, vote for a Republican, if she's willing to do something around financial responsibility about paying for things rather than saying everything's for free. And if you're a Republican, vote for a Democrat who's willing to acknowledge that our entitlement programs are not sustainable. Until we reward good behavior from elected officials who actually want to put country first, then you're going to get more of what passes for political debate, and most of the political debate we have right now is totally caught in the 20th century. When the challenges that you're facing as students and professors is how we do forward-leaning, and our country is at its best when we're forward-leaning. Thank you all very much.